Before I stepped into that shed that afternoon, I had no idea something so small, a moment, a glance, a conversation, could shift the way you see yourself after years of routine. Oh, before I forget, let me just say, if you're watching this, tell me where you're tuning in from. I always love seeing the cities pop up in the comments. It makes me feel like we're all sitting together sharing coffee and stories. And if you enjoy hearing about life's quiet surprises, the kind that make your heart flutter long after, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps me keep telling these stories that somehow, in the strangest ways, always end up being about us all. Anyway, this one happened a few months ago, one of those overcast days that felt heavier than it should have been. The kind of day when the clouds seem to hang low enough to touch, and you start feeling like maybe they're pressing on you a little too. I'd been out in the garden, trying to trim back the overgrown rose bushes that had long since stopped blooming. My husband, Michael, had gone into town for errands, and my daughter, Emma, was upstairs working on something for her art class. I remember I had just pulled open the door to the garden shed, that creaky old thing that's been leaning to one side since forever. The smell inside hit me first, a mix of earth, rust, and faint sweetness from the dried lavender I'd hung up months before. It was dim, just a slit of light coming through the small window, catching the dust floating lazily in the air. I'd gone in looking for the pruning shears, but as soon as I stepped inside, I heard footsteps behind me. When I turned, it was Daniel, Emma's boyfriend. He was holding a small bag of soil, his hair slightly damp from the drizzle. "Hey, Mrs. Parker," he said, his voice easy but polite. "Emma said you might need a hand out here." Now, Daniel's one of those young men you can't help but like, polite, thoughtful, never in a rush to talk about himself. He had a way of standing quietly, as if he respected the space around him. I smiled and told him I'd be fine, that it was just pruning, but he stepped forward anyway, setting the bag down with a soft thud. "You sure?" he asked. "Looks like it's going to pour." The rain started tapping on the tin roof as if to agree with him. A deep roll of thunder followed, and within seconds it wasn't just a drizzle anymore. It was a downpour. We both laughed a little, realizing we were stuck there together. "It's fine," I said, brushing a bit of dirt from my hands. "Haven't had company in here for a while." He grinned. "It's cozy." That word hung in the air longer than I expected. Cozy. The truth was, it was. The smell of wet earth mixed with the lavender, the rhythmic sound of rain on metal, the way the air felt thicker, warmer. It reminded me of summers long gone, when life had more surprises and I didn't measure my days by chores or quiet dinners. He leaned against the wall, glancing at the tools lined up neatly on their hooks. "You've got everything in order," he said. "My mom could never keep her shed this tidy." I chuckled. I think that's what happens when your kids move out. You start organizing everything else in their place. There was a pause, one of those easy silences that doesn't feel empty. I could hear the rain soften, turning to a steady patter. He asked me about the garden, what it grew, how long I'd been tending it, and I told him stories of when Emma was little, helping me plant seeds she'd forget to water. He laughed, really laughed, and I realized how rare it was lately to have a real conversation that wasn't about schedules or bills. At one point, he noticed a small framed photo on the shelf, my late mother smiling in front of the same rose bushes outside. "She looks like you," he said softly. That caught me off guard. I hadn't looked at that picture in years without feeling the pang of loss, but somehow the way he said it didn't make me sad. It made me feel seen. Time seemed to stretch differently in that shed. Maybe it was the storm outside, or maybe it was that quiet sense of being present with someone who wasn't rushing to fill the silence. Daniel talked about his future, how uncertain it felt, how he wanted to make something of himself but didn't yet know what. I listened, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like my words mattered when I answered. Sometimes, I told him, You don't need to know where you're going. You just have to start walking and trust that the road will teach you." He smiled, thoughtful. "That sounds like something my dad would have said. I wish I'd heard it from him." The moment felt fragile, like glass, one you handle gently so it doesn't break. I could sense his sincerity, that quiet ache of someone still figuring out life. And maybe because I'd once been there too, or maybe because I'd spent years trying to hold everyone else together, something in me softened. The rain began to ease, light filtering through the window again. He offered to carry the soil inside once it stopped, but we both lingered a little longer, neither of us saying much. Just the creak of the wood, the smell of the damp ground, and the feeling of being understood without having to explain yourself. When the rain finally stopped, he opened the door and looked back at me with that same calm smile. "Thanks for the talk," he said. "Didn't expect to spend my afternoon hiding from the rain, but I'm glad I did." I nodded, smiling back. "Me too." As he stepped out into the soft light, I stood there alone in the shed for a moment longer. The quiet felt different now. Not empty, but peaceful. Sometimes life doesn't give us grand moments or perfect days. Sometimes it just gives us a small space, a bit of rain, and someone who reminds us we're still part of the world. That day in the garden shed, something in me woke up. Not a romance, not longing, just a reminder of who I'd been before everything got so still. And maybe that's all I needed to remember, that even at 58, life still has ways of surprising you, if you're willing to open the door and step inside. The next morning, the world outside was washed clean. The rain had left everything glistening. The roses, the path stones, even the old wooden fence that had started to lean with age. I stood at the kitchen window with my cup of coffee, watching the light move slowly through the mist. It was one of those quiet mornings when the house still felt asleep. The only sound was the low hum of the refrigerator and the tick of the clock above the stove. Emma had left early for class, and Michael was already at work. It was just me, the empty kitchen, and the faint smell of rain drifting in through the cracked window. My thoughts, though, kept circling back to the shed, to that soft light through the dusty glass, to the easy rhythm of conversation, to Daniel. It wasn't attraction, not in the way stories like to make it seem. It was something gentler, more unexpected, a kind of warmth I hadn't felt in a long time. The sort of feeling that doesn't come from excitement, but from being noticed. It's funny how much that matters after years of being someone's mother, someone's wife, someone's caretaker. Somewhere in the middle of all that, you forget to be someone for yourself. By the time the morning had stretched into noon, I decided to go back out to the garden. The air was still damp, and the ground soft beneath my shoes. I could smell the earth, rich and sweet. The shed door creaked when I opened it, and for a second, I'd almost expected to see him there again, leaning against the wall, smiling that calm, open smile. But of course, it was empty. I spent the next hour sorting through the shelves, sweeping out the floor, and trying to convince myself I wasn't waiting for anything. Then, as if the universe had been listening, I heard footsteps on the gravel path behind me. "Mrs. Parker?" His voice carried easily over the soft rustle of leaves. I turned, and there he was, holding a small wooden crate filled with potted herbs. "Emma said you might want these," he said, setting them down just inside the door. "From the nursery. She thought they'd brighten things up out here." I smiled, a little surprised. "That was thoughtful." He shrugged. "She mentioned you've been redoing the garden." I nodded, though it wasn't exactly true. I hadn't been doing much of anything lately, just small things to make myself feel like I was moving forward. He looked around the shed, noticing the broom still in my hand. "You always do this by yourself." "Mostly," I said. "Michael's not much of a gardener, and Emma's usually too busy. It's peaceful, though. I like the quiet." He smiled faintly. "Yeah, I get that." There was a long pause, not awkward, just filled with the hum of afternoon. He crouched beside the crate, running a finger over the soil of one of the pots. "This one's mint," he said, looking up at me. "You can tell by the smell." I leaned closer, and he crushed a leaf lightly between his fingers, releasing the scent. The sharp, fresh smell filled the air. It brought back summers from years ago, when my mother and I used to drink mint tea on the porch, the kind she grew herself in little clay pots. "You have a good eye for plants," I said softly. He smiled, a little bashful. "My grandmother used to garden. She taught me a few things. Said plants tell you what they need if you just listen long enough." I laughed quietly. I like that. Listening to plants. Maybe I've been doing that without realizing it. He looked at me then, not in that fleeting way young people often do, but with a kind of stillness. "I think that's what you're good at," he said, "listening." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The wind outside rustled through the trees, and the light shifted across the floor. It wasn't a heavy silence. It was the kind that lets you breathe, the kind that fills you up instead of pressing down. I busied myself by arranging the herbs along the small table by the window. "You know," I said, "you don't have to call me Mrs. Parker all the time. Makes me feel like a teacher or something." He laughed. "What should I call you then?" "Margaret," I said, "or Maggie. Most people just call me that." "Maggie," he repeated, testing the sound of it. "I like that better." Something in his tone made me smile, though I wasn't sure why. Maybe it was just the simplicity of hearing my name spoken kindly, without pretense. We spent the rest of the afternoon working side by side, repotting the herbs, clearing out the space, talking about little things. The sky shifted from pale gray to a soft gold as the sun began to set, and the air filled with the scent of mint and damp wood. When we finally stepped outside, the garden looked alive again. Neat rows of green, the promise of something new beginning. He brushed his hands off on his jeans and looked around, satisfied. "You know," he said, "this place feels different now." "How so?" I asked. He thought for a moment. "Like it's awake." I looked out at the garden, the light fading, and realized he was right. Something had changed. Maybe not in the garden, but in me. That night, after dinner, I went out again. The air was cool, the world quiet except for the soft chirping of crickets. I stood by the shed door, letting my hand rest on the worn wood. I thought about how, at 58, I'd long stopped expecting surprises. But life, it seemed, still had a few gentle ones left to give, the kind that didn't demand anything, that didn't take, that just reminded you how to feel alive again. And as I stood there under the soft glow of the porch light, I couldn't help but smile, not because of him or what might come next, but because, for the first time in a long while, I felt a quiet kind of peace. The kind that grows slowly, like mint in the sun, patient and steady, waiting for someone to notice it. The days that followed slipped by gently, almost without me noticing. The weather had turned crisp, and the air smelled faintly of pine and damp soil. Every morning I would walk out to the garden with my cup of tea, watching how the mist hung over the grass before the sun melted it away. The herbs Daniel and I planted had already begun to take root, little signs of green pushing up with quiet determination. It's strange, the way certain moments start echoing in your thoughts long after they're over. That afternoon in the shed kept returning to me, not as a sharp memory, but as a soft presence. Sometimes I'd catch myself smiling when I saw the empty crate or the neatly lined pots by the window. It wasn't about him, not really. It was about what the moment had reminded me of. That connection still existed in the world, that you could be seen for who you were without explanation or expectation. A few days later, Emma asked if I could help her set up for a small gathering. She and Daniel were hosting some friends in the backyard, just a casual evening around the fire pit. I agreed, of course. I baked my old lemon cake recipe and arranged candles along the patio. I remember thinking how nice it felt to have the house full again, to hear laughter drifting through the windows. As the guests arrived, Daniel came in carrying a bag of charcoal, greeting me with that same easy smile. "Hey, Maggie," he said. It was the first time he'd said my name since that day in the shed. The way it sounded, familiar, friendly, unforced, made me feel something small but warm inside. "Need any help?" he asked, setting down the bag. I waved him off with a laugh. "I think I've got the food part handled. Just don't let anyone set the lawn on fire." He chuckled and nodded. No promises. The evening unfolded in a comfortable blur. Music played softly, the air hummed with conversation, and the fire crackled under the growing dark. I watched Emma and Daniel together. How natural they were, how young. It filled me with a quiet pride, but also a twinge of nostalgia. There's something tender about watching youth unfold, knowing you've walked that road but can't quite go back. At one point, as the laughter softened and the others drifted toward the fire, I found myself alone in the kitchen, rinsing dishes. The window above the sink looked out toward the garden. The lights from the patio cast a golden glow over the shed. I could see Daniel outside, stacking chairs, moving carefully so as not to wake the night. I don't know why, but I stepped out to join him. Maybe it was the way the night felt, quiet but alive, or maybe it was just that lingering sense of unfinished conversation. "Need a hand?" I asked, walking toward him. He looked up, surprised but glad. "You sure? It's cold out." "I don't mind," I said, taking one of the chairs from him. The air was cool enough to make our breath visible, and the faint scent of smoke from the fire hung between us. We worked in silence for a while, stacking chairs, folding blankets, listening to the low murmur of voices from the patio. The garden looked beautiful under the soft light, silvered leaves, a shimmer of dew on the grass, the herbs gently swaying in the breeze. When we were done, we both paused, hands resting on the last chair. "You really brought this place back to life," he said, looking toward the shed. I smiled faintly. I think it was both of us. He turned toward me then, and for a moment we just stood there, facing each other in the cool dark. There was something unspoken between us, understanding, gratitude, a quiet recognition of how strange and simple human connection can be. "Can I tell you something?" he asked after a pause. "Of course," I said. I didn't have a place like this growing up. Somewhere that felt steady, safe. I guess that's why I like coming here. It reminds me what that's supposed to feel like. The honesty in his voice caught me off guard. I didn't know what to say at first. There was so much kindness in his tone, so much quiet truth. I finally said, "That's a good thing to have. A place where you can just be. Everyone needs that." He nodded, eyes thoughtful. "Oh, that kind of person, you know? You make a place feel like that." I felt a lump form in my throat, the kind that comes when someone says something that touches a part of you you didn't realize was still tender. "Thank you," I whispered. "That means more than you think." He smiled gently, and for a few seconds, neither of us moved. The sounds from the patio faded into the distance. The air between us felt calm, like the world had paused just long enough to let the heart breathe. After a while, I broke the silence. "You'd better get back before they think you've disappeared." He laughed softly, stepping back toward the path. "Good night, Maggie." "Good night, Daniel." When he walked away, I stood there a moment longer, the cool air brushing against my skin, the soft light from the shed spilling out across the grass. I could feel the faint ache of memory stirring inside me, not of lost youth, but of something simpler, the warmth of being part of a moment that mattered. Later that night, when the house had gone quiet, I found myself sitting by the window with a blanket around my shoulders. The moonlight stretched across the garden, catching on the glass of the shed. I thought about the years behind me, about the way time softens things, about how connection sometimes shows up when you least expect it. And in that stillness, I realized something. It wasn't Daniel I was drawn to. It was the way he reminded me that I was still capable of feeling deeply, of caring, of noticing the small, beautiful details in the world again. It had been years since I felt the kind of gentle awareness, that sense that life still had quiet magic tucked into ordinary corners. The shed, the rain, the mint, the laughter. It all blended together into something wordless but real. That night, I closed my eyes and whispered a silent promise to myself, to keep noticing, to keep opening doors, even the ones that creak from being closed too long. Because maybe that's what life at 58 is really about, finding the courage to keep rediscovering what makes your heart feel alive. Autumn settled in quietly that year. The days grew shorter, the mornings cooler, and the air carried that unmistakable scent of change, fallen leaves, faint wood smoke, and a touch of melancholy. The garden had begun to fade, the once bright herbs now soft and pale around the edges, but I didn't mind. There was a strange beauty in watching things slow down, in letting them rest. Emma had been busier than ever, preparing her art portfolio for graduation. The house often echoed with the scratch of her pencils or the rustle of canvas. Michael, as usual, spent long hours at work, and our conversations had settled into familiar patterns, comfortable but distant. And yet I felt different, calmer, maybe, lighter. The moments with Daniel had become small ripples in my memory, soft reminders of something that had shifted inside me. It wasn't about him anymore. It was about the quiet truth he'd helped me remember, that life keeps offering connection even when we stop expecting it. It was late October when I saw him again. The afternoon sun was low, painting the yard in that golden light that only comes once a year, when everything feels like it's holding its breath before winter. I was out by the shed, sorting through some old clay pots, when I heard footsteps behind me. "Hey, Maggie," he called softly. I turned, smiling before I even saw him. "Daniel, I thought you'd gone back to campus already." He shook his head. "I'm heading out tomorrow. Wanted to stop by, say goodbye." There was something in his tone, gentle, steady, that made me set the pot down and face him fully. "I'm glad you did," I said. He glanced around the garden, the same way he had that first day. "Looks different now," he said quietly. "You brought it back." "Maybe," I said, "or maybe it just needed someone to notice it again." He smiled at that. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The leaves rustled overhead, and a single ray of sunlight slipped through, catching on the dust in the air. It felt like time had slowed, like the world was letting us have one last pause before it moved on. "I wanted to thank you," he said finally. "For listening." I don't know, reminding me that people can care, even when they don't have to. I felt my throat tighten a little. "You don't have to thank me, Daniel. You reminded me of something, too, that it's never too late to start paying attention again." He nodded, his eyes warm. "You know, I think I'll miss this place." "You'll come back," I said, smiling. "Emma will make sure of that." He laughed softly. "Maybe so." Then, after a pause, he added, "But even if I don't, I'll remember it." We stood there for a while longer, just talking, about nothing in particular. About the weather, the college, the upcoming holidays. Ordinary things, but there was comfort in it, a kind of peace that didn't need anything more. When he finally turned to go, he hesitated, glancing back once. "Goodbye, Maggie." "Goodbye, Daniel," I said. And then he was gone, down the path, past the gate, his figure dissolving into the soft gold of the late afternoon. I stayed there long after, watching the leaves drift across the grass. There was no sadness, only a quiet fullness, the way the heart feels when something ends gently instead of breaking. That evening, after the sun had set and the house was still, I went back out to the shed one last time. The air was cool, the light from the porch barely reaching the doorway. I stood there, listening, to the distant hum of crickets, the rustle of leaves, the faint echo of memories stitched into the walls. On the small table by the window, the mint plant still thrived, stubborn and green. I plucked one leaf, rolled it between my fingers, and breathed in its scent, fresh, sharp, alive. And I smiled. Because life, I realized, doesn't always give you grand stories or perfect endings. Sometimes it gives you something quieter, a moment, a kindness, a small reminder that the heart can wake up at any age. When I walked back toward the house, the porch light cast a long, warm path through the darkness. I could see my reflection faintly in the window. Older, yes, but softer somehow, more present. That night, I sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and looked out at the garden. The shed stood still and silent beneath the trees, but it felt alive in a way it hadn't before. A part of me was still in there, the part that had been waiting all those years for something to stir. And it had. So if you're watching this right now, wherever you are, tell me where you're listening from. Maybe it's a small town, maybe a big city, maybe somewhere in between. But I hope in your own way you felt what I did in that little shed. That quiet, steady reminder that we don't stop growing just because time keeps moving. So here's to new seasons, to unexpected moments, and to all the ways life keeps whispering. You're still here, and there's still more to feel. And if this story found you when you needed it, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need it too. Because sometimes all it takes is one story to remind us we're not finished yet.